A huge hit both critically and commercially, Dark Souls has proven to be hugely influential over the last decade. Many games have borrowed elements from the Souls formula, while others appear to have recreated FromSoftware's innovative mechanics wholesale. These homages to Dark Souls appeared quickly, hoping to cater to a rapidly growing fanbase by offering similarly challenging games with matching depth. Other games in FromSoftware's catalog like Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro won't appear on this list. Instead, we'll take a look at what other developers have created by iterating on From's formula. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 best Dark Souls games that aren't Dark Souls. Number 10, The Surge 2. Developer Deck 13 Interactive seem to have carved out a niche for themselves in creating Souls-like games since releasing Lords of the Fallen in 2014. That game had a gritty fantasy setting and was clearly beholden to Dark Souls, but Deck 13's The Surge and its sequel have pivoted to a sci-fi setting, ditching great swords and magic for body augmentation and nanomachines. The Surge 2 has quick and brutal combat which feels closer to Bloodborne than Dark Souls. A key mechanic unique to The Surge is the ability to target specific body parts, and once enough damage has been inflicted, these limbs can be severed with a visceral finishing move. That's predominantly how you'll acquire new gear. A common criticism of The Surge was its uninspired setting and level design, and it's clear the developer is focused on improving these areas in the sequel. And to be fair, they largely succeeded. While both Surge games indulge in some rote sci-fi nonsense in terms of their plot, they're both mechanically complex and enjoyable. Number 9, Immortal Unchained. Immortal Unchained feels like it was unfairly overlooked. Reviews of the game were mixed, but for the Souls fan, there's some intriguing elements here. The game took a different approach to its contemporaries, creating a Souls-like focused on ranged combat. Bows and swords are swapped out for shotguns and sniper rifles. The game's sci-fi setting is loosely based on Norse mythology, and the plot revolves around warring godlike beings. In true Dark Souls fashion, the player character wakes up in a prison with amnesia and is promptly released so he can slay his way through a pantheon of gods. At a glance, Immortal Unchained has more in common with Gears of War than Dark Souls, but it's quite different in practice. There's no cover system, so instead you rely on dodging enemy projectiles, waiting for an opportunity to return fire. This game loves a glowing enemy weak spot, and many fights will boil down to figuring out which of your enemy's attacks leave these weak spots exposed. Immortal Unchained is more low budget compared to some of the other games on this list, but if you can look past the slight lack of polish, then the game has quite a lot to recommend in it. Number 8, ASHEN. Almost every mechanic in ASHEN has an equivalent in Dark Souls. ASHEN's combat is slightly pared back when compared to other Souls-likes, but it still feels tactical and weighty enough to be enjoyable. Victory often comes down to how well you've managed your stamina meter. Overall, it's simpler and less intimidating than many other Souls-likes. ASHEN is an ideal introduction to that kind of action RPG. The game insists on you playing in co-op either with an AI companion or with another player, and they'll seamlessly join your game through some unintrusive matchmaking. Co-op is of course a feature in Dark Souls, but it's positively encouraged in ASHEN. The game's presentation is charming as well. The characters and world are rendered in a cartoonish and expressive art style that's reminiscent of early indie darling Journey. While ASHEN doesn't add anything new to the Souls formula, it's absolutely very competent and enjoyable as an adventure in its own right. Number 7, Dead Cells. Dead Cells is a 2D platformer developed by Motion Twin and released in 2017. Dead Cells is a roguelike similar to games like Hades, Spelunky, and Enter the Gungeon. This means rather than a linear progression through the game, each run will unlock new gear and upgrades to increase your character's power and survivability in subsequent runs. During a run, enemies will drop weapons which fall into 3 categories of melee, ranged, and traps. Traps prove to be particularly powerful, allowing you to set one to deal with enemies while you're busy fighting another, or cowering in a corner. During the run, you can choose to specialize with one weapon type, boosting your damage and effectiveness with that particular type. In any given run, you'll pick your route through various procedurally generated biomes, prisons, castles, and crypts, all common ground for the Souls-like. At the end of some of these areas, you'll run up against the game's epic bosses. On top of that, Motion Twin released a steady stream of updates and DLCs for the game since its release. Number 6, Death's Gambit. The Castlevania series, most notably in Symphony of the Night, was famed for its complicated maps, which were laid out in such a way that areas folded back on themselves and were linked together in ingenious ways. FromSoftware performed the same feat in 3D space with Lordran. Death's Gambit is clearly a game in love with both of these franchises. While Death's Gambit's pixelated aesthetic is based on classic Castlevania, the story and gameplay are pure Dark Souls. Early in the game, your character Soren, a recently killed soldier, is made an offer by a personification of death. In exchange for resurrection and immortality, Death wants you to hunt and kill other immortals. By gaining shards, your all-purpose currency for leveling up and purchasing items, you can level up a range of stats, which will in turn unlock powerful new abilities when certain weapons are equipped. These abilities will often deal tremendous damage and sometimes grant you a short-term buff as well. Death's Gambit boasts both engaging combat and its narrative, and if you're a Castlevania and Dark Souls fan, this game is an excellent combination of the two. Number 5. CUPHEAD. This game has a gorgeous vintage animation aesthetic reminiscent of early Disney. The heroes, Cuphead and Mugman, are rendered beautifully and imbued with tons of character. Connections with Dark Souls might seem spurious at first, but stick with us. Both games share a steep difficulty curve. Behind Cuphead's cutesy appearance beats the heart of a fiendishly hard platformer, and there's more linking the two games. As a nod to Dark Souls, Cuphead borrows FromSoftware's infamous game over text, "You died," only now with an added cheery exclamation mark. You'll see that game over screen a lot. While Cuphead has some traditional platformer levels, the bulk of the game is a boss rush. And like Dark Souls, the key to beating these multi-phase nightmare encounters is to study the boss's patterns, learning which subtle animations precede which attack so you can find the perfect opportunities to retaliate. Cuphead also has its own version of a dodge, roll, and parry system for good measure. Number 4. Nioh 2. Team Ninja are perhaps one of the only game developers who can rival FromSoftware when it comes to creating intricate combat systems. And while Team Ninja's Nioh and its sequel crib a lot from Dark Souls, the combat borrows just as much from Team Ninja's notoriously difficult Ninja Gaiden series. Nioh 2 is a prequel, so it's an excellent place to start with the series. Most of the systems from the first game are carried over and refined in the sequel. However, there are a couple of notable gameplay additions. Soul cores can be collected from fallen enemies and used to transform yourself into a monstrous yokai, allowing you to unleash devastating attacks. The other addition is the Burst Encounter, a special parry which can counter an enemy's most deadly attacks, which you'd otherwise find are unblockable. It's a high-risk, high-reward maneuver that allows you to create openings against strong foes and bosses. Sadly, common criticisms leveled at Nioh still apply to the sequel, namely a laborious loot system and an uninspiring plot. But there's still a dizzying amount of mechanical complexity to get stuck into if that's your thing. Number 3. Mortal Shell. In appearance, this game hews closely to the Dark Souls aesthetic. You'll explore gloomy, forsaken places, fighting against hordes of undead knights and other monsters. If you've played your fair share of FromSoftware titles and Souls-likes over the past decade, you might be inclined to skip this game thinking you've seen it all before. However, Mortal Shell has a number of innovations which make it easy to recommend to veterans and newcomers alike. In the place of more traditional character builds, we now have shells. Shells are corpses which can be possessed by the ghost-like player character named the Foundling. The game features 4 shells which fit neatly into various fantasy archetypes, such as knights, rogues, and mages. Each shell can be customized through their own unique skill trees. Switching between these shells gives players more freedom and helps to avoid the common problem of new players committing to a character build, only to discover 10 hours into the game they've picked a dud class and inadvertently chosen to play on hard mode. Another innovation is the hardening mechanic. This ability briefly transforms your character into solid stone, allowing you to tank through even the most devastating of attacks without suffering any damage, and putting your opponent on the back foot at the same time. Number 2. Blasphemous. Blasphemous is a 2D Metroidvania. The setting and story of Blasphemous is inspired by Catholic religious art and iconography, specifically from Seville, Spain. Francisco de Goya's painting, A Procession of Flagellants, has been cited by the developers as a particular influence, and even just a quick glance at that picture will reveal the basis for many of Blasphemous's character designs. These influences prove fertile ground for the hideous cast of enemies you'll face throughout the adventure. Blasphemous really does excel at weird and disturbing disturbing monster designs, best exemplified by the grotesque bosses you'll face. The game can also be astonishingly violent. Once enemies are sufficiently weakened, they can be executed in wincingly brutal fashion, reminiscent of a Mortal Kombat fatality. Mechanically, the game will be instantly familiar to any Dark Souls veteran. The game features an equivalent to Estus flasks for healing, which must be carefully rationed if you're to survive long enough to reach the next checkpoint. There's both a parry and dodge roll as well, and instead of gear and a leveling system, character customization is achieved through unlocking perks and equipping stat-boosting relics. Overall, Blasphemous does an excellent job of creating a world as equally grim and hostile as FromSoftware's games, but it manages to do it in a way that feels fresh and new. Number 1. Hollow Knight. Another 2D Metroidvania game adapting the Dark Souls formula, Hollow Knight is best described as Pixar does Dark Souls. The game's characters are based on insects, and each one is beautifully drawn and lovingly animated. The player controls an unnamed diminutive knight, referred to as Little Ghost throughout the game. Much like the lands you'll encounter in Dark Souls, you'll arrive at Hollow Nest after its inhabitants have gone mad, and the world is on the verge of a further cataclysm. During the adventure, you'll accumulate charms, which can be equipped to grant new abilities or alter existing ones, sometimes drastically. Interestingly, casting spells and healing consume the same resource in Hollow Knight, so there's an interesting balance to be struck between firepower and healing, particularly when fighting some of the game's harder bosses. Hollow Knight's world is brimming with secrets for inquisitive players to discover. As in Dark Souls, exploring the world fully will open shortcuts or new hidden areas. That's the end of our list, but let us know down in that comment box if you can think of any other excellent Dark Souls games that aren't Dark Souls. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.